Have you ever been alone on a school bus at night, or thought you were? What if, in the stillness of that empty seat beside you, something, or someone, was watching you from the shadows? Imagine the dim lights flickering as you're the only one left, the soft hum of the engine vibrating under your feet, and the windows shrouded in darkness. You'd think you were safe, wouldn't you? After all, school buses are supposed to be a part of childhood, a routine you trust. But every so often, something darker lurks beneath that sense of security. Something that could change everything you thought you knew about that seemingly harmless ride home. There are places where even the most familiar things turn into something much more unsettling. The bus stop you've been to 1,000 times, the driver you see every morning. They could be hiding secrets far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through 3 chilling, true stories, each one more unnerving than the last, that all share one thing in common: a school bus. Each story is built from the terrifying experiences of those who found themselves trapped in these haunted vehicles, trapped with forces they couldn't explain. What would you do if you were on that bus? Stay close as we unravel the mystery and come face to face with the unknown. Because once you board this ride, there's no turning back. Before we proceed to unravel the mystery, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated when new videos are being posted. It had been a long day for Jason, one of those days where every class felt longer than the last. By the time the final bell rang, he couldn't wait to get home. As the other kids flooded out of the school gates, he boarded the bus, expecting a quiet ride, the familiar sounds of tired chatter, the shuffle of papers, and the rhythmic hum of the engine that had carried him so many times before. But tonight, things felt different. The bus was nearly empty. Only a few others had stayed behind after school, but one by one they got off, leaving Jason alone with the driver. The cold wind from the open window sent shivers down his spine as he sat, staring at the empty rows of seats, the bus eerily quiet except for the hum of the engine. But there was one seat in the very back of the bus that caught his attention, a seat that seemed oddly occupied. Jason squinted through the dim light, the shadows at the back of the bus shifting unnaturally. He couldn't make out a face, but there was something there, something moving. His heart began to race. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the play of light, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing moment. He wasn't alone. Every time he looked back, he saw a shape, a shadow. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. A child? No, far too tall, far too strange. Jason's breath hitched. His eyes locked on the seat again. The figure was gone, or was it? But then, a strange feeling settled over him. It wasn't just the bus that was silent. The world outside seemed to have grown quiet too. Jason's eyes darted from the window to the back of the bus, his senses on high alert. No other passengers had been on board. There was no one but him and the driver. But the figure in the back remained, flickering in and out of view, like it was trapped between dimensions. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He turned, just as the figure reappeared, this time much clearer. It was a child, a pale child with hollow eyes and dark hair that framed a face twisted with a grin that didn't belong to any living thing. Jason's stomach twisted. His heart pounded in his chest. The bus crept along a long stretch of dark road, passing by nothing but fields and thick trees, and then suddenly, It stopped. No lights, no sounds. Just nothing. Jason turned to the driver. The man sat, still as stone, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He didn't move, didn't blink. Jason felt his pulse race, his throat dry. "Hey!" Jason shouted, his voice trembling, but the driver didn't answer. The bus was stuck in the middle of nowhere. Jason's hand trembled as he looked back to the shadowy figure. The child was no longer in the seat, but standing at the back of the bus, its pale form illuminated by the dim light from above. The grin was gone. Instead, the child's lips parted, and a voice, soft, chilling, and somehow far too old for a child, whispered, "I'll never leave." Frozen, Jason couldn't move. His gaze locked with the child's, feeling his body go cold, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. It was like the very air around him had thickened. And then, as if the world snapped back into place, the bus lurched forward again, as if nothing had happened. The engine roared to life, and the child, along with the eerie presence, was gone. Jason didn't say a word to the driver as he got off at his stop, heart pounding, breath ragged. But as he recounted the strange event to his friends the next day, something even stranger occurred. The bus driver, an old man who'd been driving the same route for decades, simply looked at Jason with a knowing glance. "You're lucky you made it through," the driver said, his voice low. "That child you saw, she's been haunting that bus for years." Jason blinked, disbelief flooding his senses. The driver's face grew grim as he continued. "She died in a crash long before you ever rode this bus, and she's never really left." Jason never took the bus alone again. No one ever saw the child again. But Jason knew the truth now. Some things never leave. It was a dreary afternoon when little Emma stood by the bus stop, her backpack sagging under the weight of her school books. The rain poured down in sheets, drenching everything around her, but still there was no sign of the bus. Her mother had told her to wait just a little longer, that the bus would be there soon. But with each passing minute, her hope began to fade, replaced by an unsettling feeling in her gut. The clock on her wrist ticked louder than usual. The usual bustle of the streets was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling quiet. The sound of her own breathing seemed too loud in the thick, damp air. The schoolyard was long behind her, and she was the only one left waiting at the stop. It was when the bus finally arrived that Emma's unease deepened. The headlights gleamed through the fog, but the bus didn't seem like the one she recognized. There were no other children on board. The vehicle was still quiet, a far cry from the usual chaos of chattering kids. And when the doors swung open, the figure inside wasn't a familiar face. The driver was strange, his pale skin almost ghostly under the dim light. His hollow eyes seemed too dark, too vacant. And when he smiled at Emma, it wasn't the kind of smile a bus driver should give, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, as if something was terribly wrong. He spoke softly, almost too softly, his voice eerily calm. "You're the only one today," he said. "Don't worry, it'll be fine." Emma hesitated, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack. She wanted to go home, but something told her that getting on the bus might not be the safest choice. Still, she climbed aboard, and the doors shut behind her with a soft hiss, locking her in. The bus began to roll down the wet streets, but Emma quickly realized something was off. The driver took turns that were unfamiliar, streets she didn't recognize, dark alleys that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. The route felt wrong, like they were heading further away from her neighborhood, not toward it. The streetlights outside flickered, casting long, ominous shadows, and Emma's unease grew with every twist and turn. As the bus moved through the city, Emma noticed something strange on the windows. Thin, jagged lines marred the glass, like scratches from a desperate, unseen hand. Her eyes flitted nervously to the back of the bus where a faint whisper echoed. Low, indecipherable voices that seemed to call her name. Her heart pounded. She tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but it was impossible to shake. The bus rumbled on, deeper into the fog, the streets growing eerily deserted. The further they went, the darker the world outside became. The air was thick and heavy, and Emma's breath quickened as the landscape around her seemed to distort, stretching the limits of reality. The faint glow of the streetlights cast grotesque shadows against the damp windows. Then it happened. The driver stopped the bus at an old, crumbling intersection. The fog swirled in thick tendrils, creeping across the pavement like fingers reaching out from the abyss. Emma looked out the window and saw nothing but an abandoned, decaying neighborhood. This was no place she had ever seen. Her pulse quickened. Suddenly, a chill ran through her as a figure appeared in the street. A child, no older than Emma, standing motionless in the fog. Their face was pale, twisted in an expression of sadness. As the bus lurched forward again, more figures began to appear, ghostly children, their eyes hollow, standing in the middle of the street. They were all silent, but their presence was overwhelming. The bus sped up, but the figures were not just standing in the street. They were chasing the bus now, appearing and disappearing in the fog. Emma's heart raced as she realized that the figures were following them. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The children's voices, once faint, grew louder and more desperate. They were whispering in unison, calling her name. "Help us! Help us!" The driver's voice broke through the chaos. "We're almost there," he said, his tone disturbingly calm, as if he had been expecting this all along. The bus began to slow, pulling into a darkened cemetery that seemed to stretch on forever. The tombstones, twisted and decayed, loomed over the bus like silent sentinels. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the bus had brought her to the final resting place of the children who had died in a terrible accident years ago. A school bus crash, the wreckage of which had been swallowed by time and forgotten by most. The children's voices grew louder, now screaming for release, for peace. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as the spirits of the lost children swirled around her, their faces distorted in anguish. She was trapped, surrounded by their wailing and their suffering. But then, just as suddenly as the chaos had started, the bus doors slammed open. Emma didn't hesitate. She bolted from the bus, her feet slipping on the wet, fog-covered ground. She ran, the cries of the children chasing her, but the cemetery seemed endless. The figures reached out for her, but she kept running, desperate to escape the grasp of the spirits. Emma never looked back. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of her home, gasping for breath, heart still racing. And when she told her parents what had happened, they only listened in silence, their faces grim. They knew the truth. The spirits of the children who died in the crash never left that bus, and now, neither would she. It was nearly 11 p.m. when Emily finally finished the last of her assignments, her schoolwork dragging on much later than usual. The halls of the school were eerily quiet as she gathered her things, ready to head home. There was only one problem. The bus she usually took had already left, and the last bus, bus 37, was her only option. The evening air felt unusually cold as she stepped onto the bus, greeted by an almost uncomfortable silence. She boarded alone, the last to get on. The driver, a man she'd never seen before, gave her a brief, impassive glance but said nothing. As the bus started moving, Emily's mind wandered, exhaustion settling in. But soon, she realized something wasn't quite right. The lights on the bus flickered, as if the electrical system couldn't quite make up its mind. The streetlights outside began to blink erratically, casting long, jerky shadows across the road. Then, the bus turned down an unfamiliar street. Emily was certain it wasn't part of the usual route. She glanced at the driver, but his face remained expressionless as he steered the bus into an even darker stretch of road. Fog rolled in from the sides, thickening the air around them. Suddenly, the faint sound of whispers tickled the back of her neck. She turned toward the other passengers, but the bus was nearly empty. It was just her and a few others, their faces hidden in the shadows. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something strange. The passengers weren't moving. They were all sitting upright, eyes forward, unmoving. The stillness was unnatural, their expressions frozen in an unsettling calm. The bus slowed to a stop at an intersection. Emily leaned forward, trying to peer through the fog. The driver didn't say a word, simply staring out of the windshield as if waiting for something. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. Something about the atmosphere was suffocating, as though the very air around her had become dense and charged with a strange energy. Her gaze turned back to the other passengers. They were fading. Their faces, once visible in the low light, were flickering in and out of existence. At first, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks on her, but it quickly became clear that the people on the bus weren't completely there. They were ghostly images, translucent, fading like the mist outside. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. She needed to get off. But as the bus continued its journey, the streets grew darker, quieter, and then the bus made a hard left turn into a secluded neighborhood, the buildings old and decaying. The fog thickened, enveloping the bus in a blanket of heavy mist, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had disappeared completely, leaving only this twisted route behind. Then, Emily heard it. The voice of the driver, low and gravelly, breaking the silence. "You're lucky you made it this far," he said, his eyes still fixed on the road. "No one ever does." Her breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? Sound. The eerie hum of the bus engine, accompanied by the faint sound of an old radio, crackling, distorted static blending with the foghorn. Before she could ask, the bus came to a stop right in front of an old, decrepit building that seemed like it hadn't seen a soul in years. The passengers had disappeared, completely vanished. The fog around her thickened, blurring everything from view. Her heart pounded as she stood up preparing to leave. She stepped off the bus, but as her foot hit the pavement, she turned to look back. The bus was gone. Where the bus had been, there was nothing but a rusted, forgotten wreck. The crumbling remains of a school bus, worn by time and corrosion, sat abandoned in the fog. The metal frame was twisted, like something that had been left to rot for years. A cold chill swept over her, and a sense of unease gripped her chest. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the wreckage. But she could no longer hear the bus's engine or the eerie hum. It was as if time itself had folded in on itself, trapping her in a place she could never leave. The bus, the real bus, had never come for her. She had never been on it at all, and in the distance, she could hear it. The whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, voices from the past, trapped in that wreck, never able to escape. Tonight, we've shared just a few of the many chilling tales that have unfolded on what should be the safest of rides, the school bus. From the phantom rider in the back of the bus, a shadow that followed one unsuspecting child to her stop, to the haunting whispers of Bus 37, a route that carried its passengers into forgotten realms where the past refuses to stay buried. And finally, the last stop, where a child was driven straight into the heart of an abandoned cemetery, surrounded by the lost souls of those who died too soon. Each of these stories shares a single, terrifying truth. What we consider the ordinary, the mundane, can sometimes become a doorway into something far darker. The things we trust, the familiar paths we walk, the safe journeys we take, can be the very places where unseen forces wait, silently, patiently. And who's to say it's all in the past? These are just a few of the eerie tales that take place on seemingly innocent school buses. But as you go on with your day, as you board that familiar ride home, ask yourself, what if we're still being watched? What if there's something waiting at the bus stop? For you. And if you've made it this far, you're definitely brave enough for more. So, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got many more eerie, unsettling stories waiting to be uncovered, but only if you're ready to face what lies beyond the veil.